Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is James Salcedo from the National Low Income Housing Coalition Field Team. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to put panelists on mute here in a second, but just wanted to get us going and to say that we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. Thanks again for joining us. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Again, this is James Salcedo from National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our CHCDF federal budget webinar. A couple of reminders for you before we get started. So today's session is being recorded. You'll get a follow-up email after the presentation with a recording that you can take a look at and share with folks in your network. We'll take questions from everyone on the webinar at the end. And to ask a question, just type right into the question box on your webinar control panel, and we'll read those out and have our speakers answer them for you. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Elaine Weiss from the NLIHC policy team.
James. I want to, of course, again, thank everybody for being on today's webinar on the budget outlook for fiscal year 18 and the impact of tax reform that tax reform could have on affordable housing and community development programs. Today's webinar is hosted by the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, or as we call it, CHCDF. CHCDF is an education, strategy, and action hub that is made up of more than 70 national organizations. CHCDF works to ensure the highest allocation of resources possible to support affordable housing and community development programs. CHCDF members represent a full continuum of national housing and community development organizations, including faith-based, private sector, financial institutions and intermediaries, public sector, and advocacy groups. We're holding today's webinar to bring advocates up to speed on the federal budget process, where it's going, and how folks can get involved to support critical funding for affordable housing and community development programs. We're also going to talk about the tax reform legislation that just passed in the House today and that has been proposed in the Senate, and how it can impact affordable housing and community development programs and their future funding. We know that there's been a lot of activity going on in Congress, so we want to really untangle and break down what's been going on and answer any questions that advocates might have. So that's our agenda, which I just laid out. And then speaking on our presentation today will be Doug Rice from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Linda Couch of Leading Age, Emily Kadick of Enterprise Community Partners, and Joe Lindstrom of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So I'm going to turn it over to Linda Couch from Leading Age to talk about where are we so far in the budget process.
Great. Thanks, Elaine. And thanks to everyone joining this webinar. It turns out it's really great timing just before the CR is set to expire and with all that's happening in tax reform. My job is to lay out where we've come, what's happened so far this year in the HUD appropriations process. I'm going to start with this really quick overview on this slide. And these three major things have happened in the HUD appropriations world. In late February, the Trump administration submitted its budget request, its budget wish list, wish numbers to Congress for FY18. It was a pretty disastrous request all around, calling for a 15% cut to HUD compared to FY17. And then these are not in order. We end here with the Senate, which really represents the high water mark for most funding programs. But after President Trump's request came out in February, we're going to look a little bit more closely at what the House did with its HUD funding bill. The House passed a bill out of the full House on September 14th. The bill overall provides flat funding for compared to FY17. So most programs don't go up at all, some are cut, but overall flat funding. The Senate got its HUD appropriations bill through the Appropriations Committee, so not through the Senate floor. It came out of committee in July 27th, and because the HUD got more overall funding through the subcommittee than it did in FY17, you'll see that the funding levels for various programs are much better than certainly in the President's request and in the House's bill. So digging in just a tiny bit into the President's request, we had this 15% cut, and just to look really a real 30,000-foot level at some of the major programs. Of course, the 2.2 million unit voucher program was hit really hard. The Center on Budget estimates that the Trump budget, if enacted, would result in about 245,000 vouchers unfunded in FY18. Project-based rental assistance under the Trump budget got a decrease. Public housing was slammed particularly hard with a 28% decrease. As we know, those 1.1 million unit portfolio has really been hemorrhaging units over the years and needs a significant capital and operating increase to stay afloat. The 202 and 811 programs, sometimes seen as safe and cute and easy to fund, also got hit hard with respectively 12 and 18% less than necessary just to maintain those units. And homeless assistance programs, I think arguably were, the nation has made huge leaps and bounds in success with addressing homelessness over the last 10 or 15 years, had an increase in the Trump budget. In what wasn't a real surprise move, a lot of these cuts came through the lens of Trump calling for cost-cutting policy reforms that they said would improve the program but save a lot of money so we wouldn't have to ask for as much cash, which they didn't. But they did ask for policy reforms, increasing rents for all residents, increasing minimum rents, which only impacts the lowest income residents, doing away with utility allowances, and freezing rents to owners who actually have to go about and run the programs. The Trump administration also called for the zeroing out and the elimination of the home and CDBG programs. But thankfully, that was only a request. They just sent a note asking for those numbers. The House and Senate went on to do their own thing. As I said, the House overall for HUD has the same amount as it did in FY17 with some shifts. But critically, way underfunds the voucher program, again, according to the Center on Budget, by about 120,000 vouchers. So those are families who are assisted right now in FY17, but funded at the House's levels. Housing authorities would no longer have the resources to keep those vouchers in use in 2018. Project-based rental assistance seems to do okay in the House bill, but the House bill leaves a gap, a hole, because it doesn't fund project-based contract administrators. That is an issue that I'm sure I hope will get resolved this year, but that is a hole in the PBRA account in the House. Public housing, again, just a real disconnect with reality. The House bill decreases funding for public housing, but home and CDBG are both maintained, again with slight cuts, but not the elimination that President Trump requested. For 2 and 811, we did see the House respond and show their desire to preserve existing housing by really significantly increasing funds in the 202 account and flat funding in the 811 account to preserve the units currently under contracts, and homeless assistance flat funded. Really thrilled that the House budget rejected all of President Trump's cost-saving measures, but did sort of nudge and nod to the authorizing committees, in this case the House Financial Services Committee. Well, we're not going to do this, but you might want to take a look at this for next year, the year after. The Senate is where we see some much better funding levels. The Senate bill has in it, as I said, $1.9 billion more in it than the House bill for HUD programs, and than FY17. So we see sufficient funding for PBRA and for the project-based contract administrators. We were hoping we saw sufficient funding to renew all the vouchers currently in use, but CBBP, constantly is running data to make sure the program funding levels are keeping up with the actual program needs, and that account is going to need another $345 million for FY18 to avoid cutting 40,000 vouchers that are currently in use. So there's a hole there that needs to be filled. Public housing, really nice to see even some of these ever so slight increases in the Senate bill. Home and CDBG level funded with FY17. 202 and 811, again, the same increases for renewals. And I should have mentioned that both the House and Senate bills include expansion of HUD's rental assistance demonstration for those 202s with certain types of rental assistance attached to them. Homeless assistance programs, thanks to the Senate allocation, got a slight increase from 17, but the National Alliance and Homelessness has an active campaign where it's urging Congress to further increase the homeless assistance account by another 9% over 17, so that 40,000 more people can be housed and not be homeless in FY18. And again, the Senate flat out rejected the cost savings reforms requested by HUD, which is great news. So this last slide just, I think, kind of hopefully sets it up for Doug to talk about, how do we get from what I just talked about to some reasonable place and appropriations, and that's going to be by raising the caps.
Thanks, Linda. I'm now going to introduce Doug Rice from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who's going to talk about where are we going.
Well, hi, everyone. So as Linda said, we're currently operating under a continuing resolution since we're already past the beginning of the fiscal year, and given that we don't have final funding legislation yet for 2018, Congress was forced to extend funding for programs at 2017 levels. This resolution is set to expire on December 8th, which means Congress will have to act by then, one way or another. But it's only one of many important items on the legislative agenda for December. Tax legislation is obviously taking up a huge amount of attention right now and will continue to do so through December, as Emily will talk about. There's also likely to be, we're likely to see soon a supplemental funding request for disaster relief come out from the Trump administration, and Congress will be considering that in December with the goal of approving additional disaster relief funds sometime next month. There's also a potential package of health provisions. The Children's Health Insurance Program has to be extended, and there's discussions about doing something to protect at least some subsidies for people participating in insurance marketplaces. And then there's the Dreamers. As many of you know, President Trump has already moved to end protections for so-called Dreamers in this country, and Congress, if they're going to do something about that, that has to be done by early next year sometime, and many are pushing it to be considered this month. So I mentioned all of these things just to point out that while it's really important for Congress to finalize a 2018 budget for HUD programs and other federal agencies, there's lots of other items on the agenda too, and these other items are likely to create competing demands and complicate and delay the approval of final appropriations for HUD programs. The good news is that one additional item that congressional leaders are also working on is an agreement to raise the very rigid budget spending caps for defense and non-defense programs that have been in place since 2011. As Linda's slides indicated, the caps, there's a separate cap for defense, separate cap for non-defense. They're very tight for 2018. They're actually somewhat lower than the 2017 level. And there's huge pressure coming, particularly from the defense side, to raise the caps for defense in 2018. In fact, Congress has moved a defense authorization bill that would add tens of billions of dollars to defense funding. It authorizes tens of billions of dollars for defense funding in 2018, but they cannot actually enact that without a change in the cap. So there have been negotiations. There are reports of negotiations and reports that they are making progress on some kind of deal to raise the caps. The goal seems to be to reach an agreement by early December sometime, though that can always change, of course. The overall contours of the deal are not yet clear, so with respect to how much additional funding would be made available under revised caps in 2018 and maybe later years, are we looking at a one-year or two-year deal? Our sense is that the goal is a two-year deal, but that may or may not be where they end up. And there's a big issue of budget offsets. There will be big pressure to offset at least some of the cost associated with raising the caps, and finding such offsets, especially for a two-year deal, is going to be difficult. That said, one way to think about it is if Congress does reach a deal on raising the budget caps by early December, that's certainly good news. Even then, it would take appropriations committees at least 3 or 4 weeks to complete negotiations on 2018 omnibus spending legislation. And that's sort of assuming that everything clicks into place easily. Many things can complicate that. And for that reason, we think that even if Congress does reach a deal, it's very likely that negotiations on a final spending bill will extend into early 2018, though appropriators would try very hard to wrap things up by the end of December. But of course, that assumes a deal is done. So where does that leave us all here? So Congress has to do something by December 8. They will likely just approve some kind of extension of the continuing resolution. They may just extend for a couple of weeks, maybe giving themselves a chance to continue work on a deal, or at least to make an effort to, if a deal has already been reached, to work on appropriations legislation, or they could extend it for a longer period. I'm betting on a short extension for a couple of weeks, which would then be followed by a longer extension that goes into early 2018. But that's speculation on my part. Overall, stepping back a bit, I think there's 3 large possible outcomes here. One is the one I've been describing mostly so far, which is some kind of budget deal to raise the caps, which would free up significant additional resources for non-defense discretionary programs, and certainly HUD programs, as critical safety net programs for low-income households, would have a claim on some of those resources. This would make it much easier to improve the funding levels in the final bill. It would make it easier to push a final bill that is much more like the Senate bill than the House bill, for example, and even to increase funding levels for some accounts like vouchers that really are shortchanged in the Senate bill as well. And I think the chances of that happening in some way is probably better than 50%. But there are other possibilities. It's possible that they will not be able to reach a budget deal at all, in which case that would leave Congress with negotiating final bills at the current law spending levels for 2018. And in the HUD context, that would look like a negotiation to resolve differences between the current House and Senate bills as they exist. And final funding levels for most programs would fall somewhere in between what you see in the House and Senate bills, though there might be changes to that. A third possibility is that for complicated reasons, budget negotiations break down completely, and Congress is able to reach an agreement neither on a broader budget deal nor on an omnibus at all. And I think the complications that could lead to that outcome are related to some of these other issues, like addressing the problems that Dreamers are facing, or other issues, funding for a wall along Mexico, for example. If they do fall apart, then the likely scenario is a full-year continuing resolution, which would extend funding for most programs at 2017 levels, but such resolutions typically have exceptions, what we call anomalies, and it would be important to push for anomalies, particularly in the large rental assistance programs that require additional funding every year just to prevent steep reductions in the number of households served. So that's certainly still a possibility, but I rate that one as a low probability. I think the chances of a full-year CR are very small at this point. So I think the other 2 options, one of the other 2 is much more likely, with the best option being a budget deal followed by an omnibus. So that's my sense of where we're headed here. But I'll add just one caveat at the end, that you know, the dynamics are very complicated here. There's a lot of uncertainty, and you know, the terrain of these decisions in the process could change significantly within a matter of weeks. And so I just urge all of you to keep in touch and keep your eyes on what's going on here, to correctly judge you know, where and when it's most effective for you to weigh in. And I know Joe's going to talk about that some, but also to judge the impact on the work you're doing in states and localities in these areas. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Doug. So first I want to caveat and say that CHCDF does not work directly on tax reform, but given its impact on affordable housing programs and future funding for affordable housing programs, we wanted to bring information to you to learn about what these proposals might do. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily Caddick of Enterprise Community Partners to talk about what the tax reform proposals include. So Emily, take it away.
Great, thank you, Elaine, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. As Doug laid out very well, the tax bill is part of a swirl of a very fluid legislative agenda, and it's really sucking up all the air in the room right now. They're still on track to try to pass tax reform by the end of the year. There's a lot of pressure points that may prevent it from going according to plan, and we'll get into those. But before we jump into that, I do kind of want to lay out what the proposed timeline is, and then we can get into what's in the bills and what we can influence in support of affordable housing, and what we can expect through the process. So as everyone I'm sure has seen by now, this week and actually today, the House passed its tax reform bill on a vote of 227 to 205, all Democrats voting no and 13 Republicans joining them. The Senate is continuing its markup of a tax reform bill that looks very different. Its plan was to wrap up today. There are a few curveballs that have been introduced, which may push it into tomorrow or even beyond. But the current plan is to have the House wrapped up today, Senate Finance Committee wraps up this week. Everyone goes home over Thanksgiving, and then the Senate comes back and passes its bill on the floor the week after Thanksgiving, conference throughout December, and have the bill on the president's desk by the end of the year. And with all of the other deadlines coming up, like the end of the continuing resolution, there really is pressure to try to get this done the first week in December. It does seem very unlikely, but again, that is the goal. So the issues that we're facing before we get into what's in the House bill and what's in the Senate bill, I think everyone is probably aware of these, but we want to kind of run through some of them, and even more obstacles have actually emerged since I put these slides together this morning as things are moving quickly. So one of the main issues is that doing tax reform through budget reconciliation means there's a lot of strings attached. One of them is that it can't raise revenues outside of a 10-year window. One is that it can't exceed $1.5 trillion, which is the agreed upon level in the budget resolution. And in order to do that, what we're seeing now is the House and the Senate are fitting into those boxes in very different ways. So it's right now difficult to see how those two bills can be reconciled in a way that won't violate either of those rules and make it impossible to advance through budget reconciliation. Another major issue is how to pay for the very drastic tax cuts that are being proposed. So right now, the bill that passed the House today had a fix on the state and local tax deduction to get the votes of at least enough of the Republicans in high tax states like New York and New Jersey and California. But the Senate bill is still proposing to completely repeal the state and local tax deduction, which is something that just won't have the votes in the House. Also, just this week, was introduced this other variable of repealing the individual mandate. So now it's not just a tax reform bill, it's a healthcare reform bill. And the coalition that successfully brought down the last several Obamacare repeal efforts is now being activated and paying attention to this bill in a way that many of the organizations hadn't been up until this point. When Congress recesses over Thanksgiving week, that's an opportunity for this sort of sleeping giant to be reawakened and oppose what's in the bill. The other new challenge that just came out today was the Joint Committee on Taxation putting together its estimates of how the bill would impact different tax brackets over the 10-year window, and found that it would actually raise taxes on everyone making less than $75,000 by the end of the 10-year window, while cutting taxes for people who make over $100,000. So that is a policy that's going to be really hard for the GOP to sell, and especially with the messaging that's going to come around that of saying, you know, we're raising taxes on the middle class, cutting taxes for the rich, and taking healthcare away from 13 million people. I think that we're going to see a lot of messaging problems over these coming weeks that could also derail what's in the Senate bill right now. And then, as Doug mentioned, there's just a really crowded legislative calendar, and as some of these other must-pass deadlines start coming up, it's going to be difficult for Republicans to maintain leverage in this. So that brings us. Yep,
and this is Elaine. I just also wanted to add about the large deficits that could impact funding for affordable housing and community development programs going forward. We know in the past with large tax cuts that it's created, you know, deficits that, you know, now we're in the situation where we have sequester caps because of these tax cuts. So even with tax reform passes, you know, $1.5 trillion is a huge hole to blow through the federal, to add to the federal debt. So we are also, of course, worried about the impact that it could have on funding for HUD and USDA affordable housing and community development programs.
Absolutely. So that brings us to what in the bill itself would impact affordable housing. And the House bill that passed today would be devastating for affordable housing. While it does retain the low-income housing tax credit, and we've gotten assurances when the GOP released the Unified Tax Reform Framework that it would retain the low-income housing tax credit, but that is about all the House bill does. It would eliminate private activity bonds, which includes multifamily housing bonds, which provide the financing for about half of all housing credit developments. And I think that one issue that differentiates bonds from some of the other programs that you know, CHCDF and all of our partners advocate for is I think there are some members of Congress who believe private activity bonds were a gap financing source like home or CDBG, where they're important, but the project could theoretically you know, use one of any of a number of sources. Whereas the private activity bonds, without them, the developments are not actually eligible for the low-income housing tax credit. So it's half that right there. That's more than half of housing credit developments that we're currently expecting to be financed that would no longer be able to move forward because they wouldn't be eligible for the credit. So right there, that's expected to reduce affordable housing production by about 700 to 800,000 units over the next 10 years. And the other issue is that by virtue of lowering the corporate tax rate, there's going to be less investor appetite and fewer benefits for investing in the low-income housing tax credit. So it makes it, you're already getting about 100,000 to 300,000 unit drop in production just by virtue of lowering the corporate tax rate, unless a change is made to sustain investor interest in the credit. So all told, according to Novogradac and Company, the House bill would reduce our future supply of affordable housing by about 1 million units. So for members who believe the House bill had a win for affordable housing by retaining the low-income housing tax credit, certainly we don't want to take that the fact that that credit would be retained for granted, but we would also be losing 1 million units at a time when we're, as everyone knows, barely struggling to keep up. So the House bill that passed today was bad news, but we also have reason to believe and if Congress is able to pass a final tax reform bill, that it's going to have to look much closer to the Senate's version. So we consider this what we'll probably see as the low point for affordable housing, and as we move through the process, we are feeling more hopeful about how affordable housing might fare. So the Senate tax reform bill that was released last week not only retains the low-income housing tax credit, but it does retain private activity bonds. So at least the two main financing structures for affordable housing would remain intact. It does not have a provision to offset the lower corporate rate, so it would still result in a net reduction in affordable housing, even while keeping those financing tools intact, though not nearly as severe as the House version that would eliminate private activity bonds. And then the modified chairman's mark that came out a couple days ago did actually include a few provisions to strengthen the low-income housing tax credit, which came from the Cantwell-Hatch Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. One of the, while that bill had about 24 provisions to both expand and strengthen the credit, most of them were left out because only the provisions that do not have any revenue impact were selected. So some of the popular provisions like income averaging, basis boosts for extremely low-income tenants, really anything that impacts the financing of developments was left out. But there were provisions that would, a few of them were pretty technical, but one that I did want to flag for this group is that it would prohibit local approval and contribution requirements in order to prevent NIMBY opposition from interfering with housing credit development. So we saw that as a really positive development from a fair housing perspective. And one of it would also create a mandatory selection criteria for affordable housing that benefits Native American communities. So there were some kind of more substantive improvements in there, but we are, of course, hoping that there will be further opportunities to strengthen the credit once we are hopefully out of the woods in tax reform. The other thing I do want to flag is that the Senate bill would change the name of the low-income housing tax credit to the affordable housing tax credit. So not necessarily the biggest win of all the provisions that were out there, but something that we all may need to get used to saying. So that is what we've seen in the Senate bill. Again, the Senate is going to have a lot more leverage. As I'm sure everyone knows, the vote margin in the Senate is much narrower. So if something can actually get past the Senate floor, the House will essentially have no choice but to pass it. We already had our first announced no vote in the Senate yesterday, with Senator Ron Johnson saying he is not going to be voting for the bill. Senator Susan Collins is already indicating that she has reservations, and we'll see how some of these other issues I highlighted a minute ago play out, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing some more senators showing reservations over the coming week. So we are continuing to advocate as part of the action campaign, which again, as Elaine mentioned, it is distinct from CHCDF, but there are a lot of similar and overlapping affordable housing stakeholders that are involved. And our message in the action campaign is continuing to urge House members, even though this bill passed today, whether it's conference or whether it's just accepting a Senate version of the bill, ultimately letting them know that we appreciate retaining the low-income housing tax credit, but if you actually want to support our affordable housing system, we need to also retain private activity bonds, need to make adjustments to offset the impact of the lower corporate rate, and that we hope the House will accept any of the improvements to the low-income housing tax credit that were included in the Senate version of the bill. So if you want any more resources or advocacy tools, obviously this week is a really critical time to be weighing in with the Senate as it's getting ready to pass a bill out of committee and go to the floor. So it's any Republican senators who are able to weigh in with Senator Hatch in support of the low-income housing tax credit are tremendously helpful. We have a lot of resources to help with your outreach on the Action Campaign website, which is rentalhousingaction.org. We do have a very broad network of more than 2,000 organizations advocating in support of these changes, which I believe is how we got to the position where we did, which is, the low-income housing tax credit could have just as easily been eliminated to raise the revenue, but it wasn't. And while today does feel like a tough day for affordable housing in the tax policy space, I think with leveraging that network that we have and continuing the outreach we've been doing, if its final tax bill does pass, I'm at least hopeful that we'll be able to get it to a much better place than it is today.
Thank you so much, Emily. Next, we're going to turn to Joe Lindstrom to talk about advocacy tips and opportunities, best practices.
Thanks, Elaine, and thanks all of you for joining today's webinar. So many of you have been involved in what we've been doing throughout the budget process. Many of you signed on to our budget letter that we did in the spring and had a record number of organizations participating. Others of you participated in our week of action that we did throughout July, at the end of July. And now we're into the third season of budget advocacy for this particular year. And as you can see, the ask is actually fairly simple right now. Congress needs to work together to lift the spending caps for FY18, maintaining parity for both defense and non-defense programs, and ensure housing and community development programs receive the highest level of funding possible. It's a fairly simple message, and we need to be sure all of you are working to get that across to your members of Congress in both the House and the Senate. Of course, there's a specific focus on those members of Congress who serve on appropriations committees. If you live in a district or a state where your member of Congress is on an appropriations committee, you've likely already heard from us because it's a very high priority place for folks to be mobilizing. But if you'd like for us to check on the importance of your member of Congress in terms of the committee assignments, please feel free to get in touch with us at the field team here at NLIHC, and we can take a look at that for you. Obviously, though, every member of Congress matters in this current discussion about lifting the caps. So reach out to the offices of your members of Congress, especially utilize existing relationships with staff who you've met along the way at previous lobby visits, or staff who may have come to community meetings you were at, or who may have visited the site of any number of your programs. Make sure you're sharing information about the impact of your federally funded programs. We put out a report earlier this year with success stories, a place to call home that Elaine worked very hard on to really show the impact that federally funded housing and community development programs have in people's lives. And while that's a great report, it pales in comparison to the impact of doing a site visit or a tour with a member of Congress who might visit and see some of the work that you're doing in your community with federally funded programs. So this can be a visit of a community center, a meal program. This can be a visit to any number of the subsidized housing developments that some of you may operate or work with. We've learned a lot over time that these visits can have a real impact. And over the last week, we had our state partners in town here at NLIHC, and that was a common theme that our statewide partner organizations kept sharing, that when they do site tours and that they actually show what these programs do to elected officials, it can have a real impact. Obviously, this is most important for those members of Congress who are new and who might have backgrounds in a certain set of issues that do not include housing. Definitely give them the exposure and familiarity with the issues because it really means a lot. We're happy to help provide some best practices and tips for successful site visits. Please feel free to get in touch with us for any of that. Remember that this is a good moment for coalition building. If you think back on the ask that I just went over on the previous slide, the first two pieces of it include lifting the spending caps and maintaining parity for defense and non-defense programs. So these first two pieces matter well beyond just housing and community development. You'll find advocates in the movement for education, healthcare, transportation, environmental justice, and many other aspects of the social justice movement who care very much about lifting the spending caps. This is something we've engaged in at the federal level with a group called NDD United. That's Non-Defense Discretionary United. And they've done their own sign-on letter, which you've surely heard about through us and through our partners who have been working with us in CHCDF. NDD United is a really great network because it allows us to talk about the multiple intersections of groups who care about the federal budget and want to see the caps lifted. So I'd encourage you to visit NDD United's web space and look to see if there are natural partnerships you can make in your community who will help amplify your voice. This really is a time when we can speak with one voice. because so often the various interest groups who use federally funded programs find themselves at odds fighting over ever more scarce resources. This is an opportunity where we're all saying, hey, lift the caps, it's essential. So really think about that as you go about building your coalition and doing that impact. We have one really good example right now in Maine, where the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition has put together a sign-on letter of more than 170 groups from multiple sectors of their movement and brought that to Senator Collins, who's on the Appropriations Committee, and it's already getting a good response. Finally, as always, you want to have a strong media presence. You want to respond to everything that's being printed about the budget and posted about the budget, and frankly, respond to things that are talking about tax reform, as Emily mentioned in the previous section of the webinar, because tax reform ultimately can contribute to increasing the debt, which puts more pressure on spending cuts and makes Congress feel like there's no room to lift the caps. So as you see more and more articles that are being posted online and that are being printed in local papers, please make sure you're responding, and remember that letters to the editor that directly reference something that was previously printed in a paper are the ones that have the highest likelihood of getting printed in a future edition. I also want to encourage all of you to use the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday and even the Christmas holiday as opportunities to talk about housing issues in your community within the media. We've all seen the annual story on Thanksgiving about people who have no homes to be thankful for, and isn't that something for us to consider on this holiday? It's great to be able to showcase our programs in those stories, but we need to also talk about solutions. And those solutions in this case can be increasing the spending caps so that there's more support for programs like the ones they're highlighting in those articles and others. So one thing that's happening right now this week is Hunger and Homelessness Awareness Week, which many of you know is a project of the National Coalition for the Homeless and the National Student Campaign Against Hunger and Homelessness. I would encourage any of you who want to be a part of some of the public awareness events that are going on as a part of this week to visit hhweek.org and see what's going on in your community. So another aspect of engagement that I really wanted to bring up and seems particularly timely right now is what if your members of Congress are hiding? And this is something we hear about more and more because we've been engaging on the budget all year. There's been the healthcare debate. We're now doing tax reform, and members of Congress have been approached with a lot of, let's call it, enthusiasm at town hall meetings. There have been rancorous protests in the Capitol about healthcare reform, and we're finding that not just members of Congress, but also their staff are becoming more and more and more reclusive and hard to get to. And so just a few thoughts to share on that as we're in the part of the year where they're really trying to get some things done. And that the first is, remember that a member of Congress who does not want to meet with you privately is inviting you to engage with them publicly, right? And there are several ways to do that. One of the most effective ones is Twitter. Members of Congress follow their Twitter mentions and the way they're trending on Twitter very closely. It's a primary function of a lot of congressional communications staff these days. So if you find that you're not getting your message through to the staff people you've traditionally worked with, express it publicly. Make sure you're using Twitter, make sure you're using op-eds and LTEs, and make sure you're using blog posts. Blog posts are easily shareable. You can place them on Facebook, you can tweet them out. It's an opportunity for you to make your argument in a way that's unedited and is really has great fidelity to the way you feel about federal funding and lifting the caps. So there's a lot of evidence that the best way to interact with your member of Congress is to do so in a public forum because they know they have to respond to that because they know other people have heard you express your viewpoint on an issue. If your members of Congress and their staff are refusing to meet with you, I always encourage people to ask for meetings in a public manner. Produce a letter requesting a meeting or a conference call. This letter will always be strongest if it comes not just from you, but perhaps from a coalition of groups in your neighborhood. And when you send in that letter requesting that meeting, go ahead and copy members of the press that the meeting has been requested. So it's harder for them to ignore you and pretend you don't exist and so forth. But even if they are successful, even if they are successful and they're hiding from you and they're not engaging and you're not getting your face-to-face time that you so very much want, remember that your emails are still being read, your voicemails are still being listened to, and that congressional staff are looking at your thoughts and actually sharing them within their meetings every day, because it's certainly true that members of Congress care about how many people they're hearing from about a particular issue, and whether it's tax reform or the budget, we need to make sure that the housing interests are being expressed not just loudly, but through many, many voices. So please continue your efforts, regardless of any frustration you might have from members of Congress not wanting to engage. So I just wanted to share some of those thoughts, and I think for now, those are the top things to be aware of in terms of engagement moving forward on the budget.
Great, thanks so much, Joe. So now we've gotten to the Q&A section of our webinar. James, do we have any questions?
We do, Elaine. And so everyone on the webinar, as a reminder, you can type your questions right into the question box on the webinar control panel and ask any question you've got on any of the material presented today. We'll have our speakers answer them. So you happen to have any questions after the presentation, you're more than welcome to get in touch with anyone who spoke today. And as a reminder again, also recording of today's presentation will be sent out to everyone in a follow-up message later today. So right now I've got a couple of questions that have come in specifically about the tax reform piece of the presentation. So let's see, the first one I've got, what do we think the impact of the tax plan will be on LIHC indicators?
That's a great question. And for those of you who are involved in financing affordable housing, you're probably very acutely aware that even the threat of tax reform has already had a major impact on the LIHC market and all of the players. So investors who have been anticipating that the corporate tax rate won't stay at 35% have already been seeking to price deals lower. And the pricing since the election, even without anything having passed on the floor until today, has settled in around a 20 to 25% corporate tax rate that's being built into these deals. So, of course, if the corporate rate is ultimately lowered to 20%, we can expect that this decrease in pricing will be baked in going forward, and that's part of the reason that we're seeking an adjustment in the tax reform bill to offset the impact on the housing credit and make sure investment stays high, because if Congress does want this program to work, it should want to make sure the housing credit is producing as many affordable units as it is today, at least as many. And if the corporate rate is higher, then less of an adjustment would be needed to the housing credit. But it is safe to say that just by virtue of lowering the corporate tax rate, there will be an impact on pricing for the housing credit, which will impact investors, syndicators, and developers, unless Congress makes some changes to offset that impact.
Okay, thank you. And Elaine, anyone else have any other thoughts to add? Okay. So this is another question specifically about LIHC. Emily, during your section of the presentation earlier, you referred to offsetting adjustments. So what options are there for offsetting adjustments that would make LIHC more appealing for companies despite lower tax rates?
Sure, yeah, and I just mentioned it again in my last response, so I'm glad someone asked for the clarification. So there's two main variables that can offset the impact of the lower corporate rate. One is changing the amount of allocable credits, and making more credits available that can go into deals, and the other variable is how many credits you can put in each deal. So for those of you who are following the effort to make the minimum 9% credit rate permanent over the last few years, that affects how much equity can go into housing credit developments. But with a lower corporate rate, the rate might actually need to be higher than 9% so that states can put more credits into projects if it's needed for financial feasibility. So if anyone wants to get into the nitty-gritty on it, I would recommend Novogradac and Company. They're the ones who have been doing all the modeling on what the impact of the lower corporate rate and all of these other changes would be on production. And they're the ones who have the longest analysis and most in-depth on what changes need to be made. One of our challenges is that because we can't know what those changes are until we know what the other what the corporate rate is and what the other things in the tax reform bill are, this wasn't something that we could introduce a piece of legislation on because we didn't know what we needed yet. So it makes it difficult as things are moving quickly to try to make sure this is included. But we do have a tremendous supporter of the housing credit in Chairman Hatch, and we've been letting him know that the importance of making these changes. And we know of at least a few other Republican senators who weighed in with him showing their support as well. But anything else that we can do to make sure he has the proposal in hand, it's really an issue of, with everything moving and all the other things we're considering, whether we can get that in or not.
Great, I've got, and thank you for that. I've got one more question that we'll address about tax reform, and then move on to some other questions that are coming in that are related to other pieces of the presentation. So can anyone talk about what we know about the status in the tax reform bill on the status of historic preservation tax credits or the new markets tax credit?
Yeah, I can take that. So the House bill repealed the new markets tax credit, which is extremely surprising since the new markets tax credit is only authorized currently through 2019. And repealing it only saves the House $1.7 billion in a $1.5 trillion tax bill. It was kind of the general wisdom up until the morning that the House bill came out that it would not be worth it for them to repeal a program that has strong bipartisan support and a proven track record for that little savings, but that is indeed what the House did. There are close to 100 members of Congress. Both parties signed on to legislation to make the new markets tax credit permanent. So again, I just want to emphasize how disappointing and surprising that was. The Senate, fortunately, is silent on the new markets tax credit, which at this point, we'll see what happens during markup. It looks like it's going to miss an opportunity to make it a permanent part of the tax code, which is disappointing, but it would at least allow the new markets tax credit to run through 2019 as currently authorized, and then, assuming there are some other tax vehicles that are going to have to come up in future years, there could be an opportunity to extend it in a year or two. Who knows what Congress will look like in 2019, and the new markets tax credit community has successfully advocated for extensions several times. The historic tax credit was repealed in the House bill as well. It is retained in the Senate bill, though there are changes that would reduce the credit, but it would still continue to exist. The other thing that was interesting about the modified Chairman's Mark that came out this week is it actually added a new credit for community development called it's called Opportunity Zones. It's modeled off of the Investing in Opportunity Act that's been introduced by Senator Scott and Representative Teaberry. And what's interesting about that is that it's modeled after the new markets tax credit, in that the idea of it is to encourage investment in distressed communities, but it doesn't actually extend the new markets tax credit. So we don't know if that'll be in any final bill, since it is a new credit, but it's something to keep an eye on, since it does seem like the sense of the Senate, at least reading the latest version of the bill, may be to kind of move away from new markets and instead put more stock in this new proposal.
Thank you. So now a couple of questions about getting involved in outreach and advocacy on these issues. A couple of similar questions. One, what advice can we give to individuals from organizations that may be less than enthusiastic about getting involved in these issues, and what advice or guidance can we give them for engaging with their legislators? And then a related question comes from someone on the webinar who works as a homeless service provider. And this person asks how they can work toward convincing their board that engaging in these issues really matters for the work that they do.
So I think the best way to get board involvement is definitely to give them a sense of how much of your organization's budget and budgets of similar organizations throughout the community comes from the federal government. Yesterday I was doing a presentation for a group in Howard County, Maryland, and what I showed them was how much their local commitment of money is versus how much the federal commitment is. And what that really shows is while local advocacy is essential to make sure money is being put to the best use, the actual resources that are needed very often generate at the federal level. So I think when board members get a sense of that, they become more open to engagement in advocacy and at least the part of advocacy that's informing members of Congress, even if you're not asking them to vote in a certain way, but if you're rather emphasizing the importance of particular programs and in particular funding levels, I think you can get board members comfortable with that. It is sometimes a process, and it involves directly interacting with those board members who have concerns or hesitations. Yeah.
And this is Linda, and I would say maybe to both questions, figuring out how you can connect the dots. All of these programs, the tax credit programs, the HUD and USDA housing programs, they're often very interconnected. Clients, consumers rely on them, commingled, and if one doesn't exist, often the other 3 programs associated with it can't happen. And so people might say, well, I don't have a tax credit program. We don't live in tax credits. Well, are you a housing authority? You're thinking about RAD. Is that your preservation? Is that how you think you're going to preserve over the long haul? Are you a voucher holder? Who's building units that have to accept vouchers? Tax credit programs do. And so all these programs really create the web of housing resources that housers rely on in total.
Great, thank you. Well, we are at the the end of our webinar, rather. We're not at the top of the hour, but we're in the middle of the hour. But thank you again so much for joining us today. If you had questions that we didn't answer, please feel free to email any of us. Here are our email addresses. And if you think of a question, tomorrow, please still email us. We're going to be continuing to monitor what's going on in Congress as we move through the budget process, and we'll keep you updated. Thanks again.